Hey everyone, welcome back to our series of lightning talks on wildfire and wildfire management technology. Today I have the pleasure of being joined by Russ Parsons and Anthony Marcozzi. Russ is a research ecologist with the Fire, Fuels, and Smoke Research Program at USFS Rocky Mountain Research Station in the Fire Sciences Laboratory in Missoula, Montana. His research at the lab spans multiple time and space scales, ranging from landscape fire, vegetation simulation modeling, to highly detailed 3D fuel and fire physics-based fire modeling. He has a PhD in forestry from the University of Montana. Anthony is a software engineer, wildfire scientist, and PhD student at the University of Montana, and also a researcher for the New Mexico Consortium. Russ and Anthony are two of the three scientists that are central figures for the creation of the Fast Fuels dataset, which is a foundational input for BurnPro 3D and QuickFire. Thank you both for joining us today to talk about vegetation models.
Yeah, thank you, John.
Thanks for having us, John.
So let's start off just talking about vegetation modeling and the challenges that come with building it. We've heard from a number of other talks and guests in this series about how integral it is to have great vegetation modeling to predict everything from fire behavior, smoke behavior, lots of downstream consequences from fire. What is the challenge of building an accurate granular vegetation model?
That's a great question. I can go ahead and start. I think for me, the fundamental problem is one of scale. The way that we have historically looked at vegetation on the landscape in order to perform some of our fire modeling tasks has been to look at things on a 30-meter spatial scale. And for certain fire modeling tasks, that's an appropriate scale to look at the problem. For others, such as looking at things like prescribed fire management, where we're looking at interaction of low intensity fires, 30-meter tends to not be in a high resolution enough scale to get at the problems that we're interested in. Similarly, when we think about actual physical fire behavior and the chemical reaction that's happening at a chemical level. So there's kind of this broad spectrum of scales that we can look at for what is the appropriate level in order to represent vegetation. Do we look at things at a chemical or leaf level? Or do we look at things all the way at this kind of broad landscape paintbrush level? And we like to think that the answer for what we're interested in terms of this prescribed fire management is probably somewhere in between that. So I think the first big challenge I see is what is the scale that we're interested in measuring these things at?
Yeah, let me add to that. So it's an incredibly exciting time to be doing wildland fire science and to be doing fuels research because there are these amazing new 3D fire models like QuickFire and the Fire Dynamics Simulator. But the challenge of the data, it's the scale is definitely part of it. That ideally you wouldn't have to worry about scale. So for example, like a real fire doesn't have any computational demands that it has to work with. But when we have to start putting data into a model, we have to break that into some voxels that have some information. And the bigger the area you look at, the more difficult it is to have a whole lot of voxels. So there's this challenge between the scale of the question you want to look at and the scale at which we represent the detail of the fuel. And then the other thing that makes it challenging is that vegetation is incredibly complex. So even a small tree has a wide range of size class of materials, ranging from the tiny little needles to the bigger branches in the tree stem, all of which are different with respect to how they burn in the real world. Thicker materials don't burn as easily or quickly as fine materials. And then you have actually within even a normal healthy tree, you have variability in the density, in the chemistry, the structure, everything else. So there's a need to abstract even at the level of an individual tree to get things into a model. So there's a whole lot of amazing aspects of vegetation that make it both remarkable but also challenging to model. And then there's the whole realm of remote sensing platforms that provide the data to capture these in different ways, and they all have their strengths and weaknesses.
Yeah, I think to add on to that last point, that's a great point, Russ. And I think what we're getting at here is that with these remote sensing platforms, whether that's a space-based satellite, whether that is aerial photography, could be a drone with a LiDAR sensor. There's kind of a broad spectrum of measurements that we can take on the landscape to tell us something about vegetation there. But the things that we can measure are often quite different from the things that we're interested in order to evaluate fire behavior, for example. So one of the great challenges that I think we'll spend a good part of our talk today on is how do we take the things that we are measuring from these platforms, whether that's LiDAR data, visible imagery, multispectral, and relate that to something that we can understand within sort of the wildland fire context.
That's great. I think I am going to come back to and spend a lot of time picking your brains about what it is we can observe from each of these data sources and how that represents the things that we actually care about knowing. But one thing that jumped out to me that I wanted to go back to is this notion that a lot of times we're working with relatively big cubes. You were saying 30 by 30 by 30 meters. I understand that Quickfire runs on a 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter Voxall. Um, it strikes me that there's something like an actuarial problem happening there, which is that if your boxes are really big, some of the noise in your predictions kind of average out. If you get this corner wrong, you might have, that might be vegetation that actually exists in this corner. But when you get down to 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter, you're less likely to get some of that averaging out in any mistakes that arise in the model.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point. Russ, go ahead.
Yeah, that's certainly true. Yeah, most of the operational fire models run not on 3D data, but on 2D data. So it's 30 meters by 30 meters flat, okay, without really a third dimension to it. So it's much easier to characterize things in a broad sense from that kind of data. But what you're missing is the detail on what's in there. So, satellite like Landsat, thematic mapper, will see that square area as, hey, this is more green and there's some more vegetation in there, but it has no idea what that vegetation is, right? So when you start thinking about prescribed fire or fuel treatments where people want to, thin the forest to change fire behavior or, make an area more resilient to future disturbance, you really have to know more about what's in that box. And that's where representing the actual trees is really critical to getting the right answers. And so, yeah, that's all those things are really, you're right, that it's considerably easier to map things at low detail or for bigger areas. And as you start to get into these more high detail mapping, there's so many different factors that come into play.
So more difficult to, go ahead. Sorry, Anthony.
Yeah, I'll add to that as well, as even when we're considering, say, a 1 meter cube or a 2 meter cube, or kind of the resolutions we tend to think of within this problem space, there's still an incredible amount of sort of averaging that's happening within even a space that small. We can think of kind of a 1 cube over the tree, even behind you in your right corner there, John. There's an incredible amount of variation within that cube. And so we can leverage that in order to make predictions that sort of average across the scale that we're interested in here.
That's super interesting. So for the purposes of this data challenge, we're talking about a specific portion of the vegetation model, which is a tree list. What's the difference in terms of thinking about building a vegetation model or predicting vegetation overall versus a tree list?
Sure.
You want to jump in there first?
Yeah. So when we talk about tree lists, we are typically talking about what in the sampling world we would call a census or a population. It is a measurement of every individual on the landscape. And one of the reasons that we've been interested in these census level measurements is because we're able to utilize a wider range of models that take us from saying there's this kind of tree at this location and it has this measured set of attributes. And we're able to take that into the 3D world that we need to communicate with a fire modeling tool like QuickFire. So that's kind of been a lot of our historic reason for being interested in this census level representation, what we call a tree list. But a tree list is, as you said, John, I mean, that's only one thing on a landscape. You can take a walk through the woods and look around, and you see that there is an incredible array of vegetation around you. And a large subset of that will have an interaction with fire when it's on that landscape. So in addition to just trees on the landscape, we also consider other discrete elements. So that can be things like shrubs, for example, large woody materials. Coarse woody debris is another one that we think of. And we also consider things on sort of a continuous level also, where when we look down at the surface, we say, what's below our feet? What are we walking on? Do we see beds of needles? Do we see beds of broad leaf fall? So all of these things are inputs that we want to consider within the context of fire modeling. And we often consider these inputs in terms of a few key descriptors. So the things that we're often interested in would be mass. How much does the stuff on the ground weigh? And depth or height. So how high off of the mineral surface level is it?
Right. So kind of the main difference between tree lists and vegetation models is you need to have all the attributes of those entities like trees. So one of the challenges, for example, is we need to know in order to know how much fuel is on a tree, like what is the weight of the foliar biomass, we typically need to know the diameter of the tree. And that's something that isn't handed to you from a point cloud. It's something you have to figure out from it. So there's a lot of processing that has to be done to take most of these, even the most detailed remote sensing data sets, to turn them into a tree list. And that's really what the nut of this problem is. It's not that easy. And the different data sources are, have very, they have strengths and weaknesses, and some of them are complementary to each other in unique ways. So one of the things we're excited about this data challenge is that the participants are going to get to work with a variety of data formats and explore the space themselves.
I'm curious about the importance of tree species in terms of thinking about how you build a vegetation model, because it strikes me that, I mean, if it's difficult to pick out the diameter of a tree's trunk from a point cloud, predicting its species from a point cloud has got to be really hard.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's really true. So, yeah, it's basically point clouds see where things are, but they don't know what they are. So, if you have the right kind of points in a point cloud, like from terrestrial LiDAR scanning or other LiDAR that's getting a lot of point density, the geometry of the objects, like the diameter of the tree stem, can be seen and kind of measured in the point cloud. That's less. It's more about having if the data sees it, it's there. Okay, but species is something that is much more difficult to tease out from these data sets because there's so many more subtle aspects to it, and the fine scale geometric differences that we can see with our eyes are typically not that easily discernible with a point cloud. So, for example, we can look at two trees and say, "Oh yeah, that is a Douglas fir, and that one is a Engelmann spruce." We're used to seeing them, okay, but seeing that in a point cloud or getting a computer to recognize that is challenging.
I'll add on to that. That's a great point, Russ. I fully agree that the things point clouds are giving us tend to be related to structure and structural elements of a tree. However, I think one of the really interesting things that UC San Diego has done here in the San Diego Supercomputing with the National Data Platform is putting us in a position where we can bring a lot of these different data sources together to improve on existing methods for getting species or getting some of these other things that we're interested out of the way that a variety of data sets come together. So utilizing structure information from a point cloud in addition to, say, visible imagery information. I think that the real power comes in bringing these different data sources together rather than any one of them individually, because they all have a lot of pros and cons.
Yeah, that's very exciting to me. The depth and breadth of data that's being made available to participants in this challenge is really awesome.
Let's, I don't think I can put it off any longer. Let's talk about these different data sources and what you think the strengths and weaknesses of each are. So lead me through, what are the most important things that you're looking at when you're building vegetation models?
Absolutely. Russ, do you wanna start?
Sure. Yeah. So yeah, there's a lot of different kinds of data. Point clouds are collections of 3D points that have a X, Y, and Z. And depending on how those are collected, you might have a whole lot of those points or not that many of those points. And they also could cover a really big area or a really small area. So kind of the most common point cloud data comes from airborne LiDAR mapping, in which airplanes are flying over the forest and they're zapping the forest with lasers. And they're getting it's called an active remote sensing system because it's getting a return from that energy. And they're mapping the terrain. So when they hit the spaces between the trees, they're capturing the ground below it, or the surface fuels around it as well. They can, shrubs and things like that can be captured. And there's a whole range of different kinds of airborne LiDAR data. There's single return, in which you get a single answer back from one hit, or there's multiple returns where you can have different levels of information. And there's different ways to process the data, but fundamentally, airborne LiDAR captures the big picture. It sees the tree tops really well. It doesn't see below the trees that well because the trees themselves are occluding what's below them, like a shadow. And then another common source for point clouds is drones, which kind of fill an intermediate scale between the airborne LiDAR scanning data and finer scale ground-based approaches. And drones typically have a different way of collecting those point clouds. The most common approach is not using a laser, but rather a photogrammetric approach in which different images are taken by the drone, and then they're reconstructed to make a point cloud, a photogrammetric point cloud that essentially is leveraging seeing the same things from multiple perspectives and then reconstructing that using trigonometry. But there's also some data sets in which LiDAR instruments are mounted on a drone, and those are some of the most detailed data sets that are out there, in which just crazy detail of all the branches and everything like that is available. And then another common form of point clouds these days is terrestrial LiDAR scanning, in which a person typically is walking through the forest and putting an instrument on a tripod and then hitting a button. And then usually you have to hide behind a tree so you don't get mapped as part of the landscape. But there's also some other approaches like backpack LiDARs and things like that. So anyway, they each have their own strengths and weaknesses. Typically, the terrestrial LiDAR and like backpack LiDARs are capturing a very, very high number of points. Like the terrestrial LiDAR scanning that we use collects 360,000 3D points per second. So a scan of a few minutes is collecting millions and millions of data points, but for a small area. So you're seeing, detail about where the branches and the leaves are. From that kind of data, it's pretty feasible to, in the right kind of forest, extract tree diameters and other metrics of the trees from those point clouds. Typically, airborne LiDAR doesn't see the stems very well because it's coming mostly from the top. So it's better at capturing the tree crown tops and less detailed for capturing the forest stem diameters and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great summary of the the sort of swath of LiDAR data that we have available to us. And that's proven to be really important for a lot of these problems that we're interested in solving. Some of the other data sources that are available to us can cover a lot of area and a lot of information. So one of the principal data sources that we have that we use to quite a lot of effect is called the FIA database. FIA stands for Forest Inventory and Analysis. This is a United States Forest Service program that's been around for some time now. And they are responsible for collecting forest inventory information throughout the entire country. And this is a manual information gathering program. So field crews go out into the woods and what we would say in forestry is they spin plots. So they would take measurements and put everything down, and all of that goes into a publicly available database. And so this is able to cover a lot of the information. John, for example, you asked earlier about how can we make predictions about things that are hard to measure. Well, we're tremendously fortunate that we have an incredible set of data available to us in which people are actually going out and measuring these things. And this data goes back, I think by this point, 30 years is when we have, for how long we have a national inventory for. It covers millions and millions of tree observations. And when we think about the power of machine learning or AI to uncover relationships between things, to make predictions, to build models, this is a tremendous data set that we have available to us in order to sort of bring all of these different things together. So that's a wonderful resource. We use it a lot in fast fuels, and I'm sure we'll go into a little bit more detail about how that happens. But one of the challenges that I want to talk to about that particular data source is that although we have all of this information, the actual locations of where that data was collected are intentionally obfuscated by law. Actually, these plot locations are kept secret within some threshold. And so one of the challenges associated with using that data then becomes, okay, well, we have this wonderful data set, but how do we relate it to the other spatial characteristics that we can measure? So for example, if we have a set of LiDAR data and we want to look at the FIA plot that corresponds to that LiDAR data, for example, we can't do that because that spatial relationship doesn't exist. So again, this is kind of another really interesting line of thought or avenue that's opened up through this NDP platform is okay, we have all of this spatial data and we have all of this FIA data available for us. What are some clever things that we can do to leverage both data sets when sort of the most obvious approach isn't available to us?
That's extremely interesting. Just because I thought it was really fascinating. Why are the specific locations of the FIA plots censored?
Maybe Russ has a better answer than I, but to my knowledge, it's to protect private landowners that are also participating in the program, as well as to protect ecological resources. For example, FIA is very interested in measuring old growth forest, and there is an element of ecological conservation associated with that. Private landowners throughout the Southeast participate in this program and maybe have an economic interest in not divulging the basal area of their particular property. I'm not sure if I missed something there, Russ. Is that about answer that?
Yeah, there's kind of two angles. So one is that the FIA data is collected across all ownerships. So it does include sampling on private land. And for private timber owners, that is essentially intelligence that they don't want their competitors to know. Their forest resources are part of their wealth that they have and part of their strategic planning. Another really important factor in this is that if the locations are known, then people could go and mess with those areas. So because the FIA data sets are used to produce national trends, each individual data point or location is actually quite influential over a much larger area. And so if it is made public where it is and somebody has an interest in saying there's more of this or less of that in their state, they could have an impact on what the sample is telling us by going out there. So that's part of the rationale. So I think it's really it's very good that that data is protected, but it does pose a significant challenge for connecting the dots. If we knew the locations, then we could just pair all these things directly and say these are the observations and this is where they took place, and it would make a lot things easier.
But then we wouldn't have a data challenge.
Yes.
Really good
Well,
point.
I think we'd still encounter some challenges anyway.
It's true.
Well, yeah, I'm still seeing at least two challenges, right? I mean, one is that presumably you can't send someone with backpack LiDAR to every acre of forest that could burn in the United States. And so your models are taking some amount of data that's cheap to have about more places in the United States and using what we know expensively about some of these very small specific places to predict what's going to be in the places we can't walk through with LiDAR. So I'd love to hear about that process, what's important for porting over our models from the places where we know a lot to the places where we know a little. And then second, you've also mentioned that what we're able to observe directly is used to derive characteristics of trees and vegetation in these areas that are not directly observable from these things. So, sort of a two-part question. One, how do you port over from areas we know a lot about to areas we don't know much about? And two, what are the things that you care about knowing? And how are you, in basic, sort of predicting those characteristics from what is observable from these data sets?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a good question. Great question. I think they're really related, actually. So if I can take an attempt at your first question, let me know if I misunderstood this, but it's kind of a modeling process, the whole workflow. So when we take in information that maybe we're seeing this from a LiDAR scan for the first time, often what we're going to do is run a process called individual tree detection. And this is a broad umbrella that encompasses a lot of different algorithms, ranging from sort of classical computer vision to cutting edge machine learning algorithms. This is a very fun subset of research. But the goal of this is to take a point cloud as input and to produce a census or a stem map, a tree list of what is out there on the landscape. The problem with that, or one of the challenges associated with that, is that stem map is lacking in information. We cannot take that stem map and make a connection to a fire model with just that information. So we need to apply another set of models to that in order to make predictions about, okay, we've measured a tree in this location and it has this height. This is typically the output of one of these individual tree detection algorithms. What do we think its diameter is? What species do we think it is? What do we think the crown base height is, or how high off of the ground does the tree crown start? These are all really important things for us in order to make predictions that connect us to this fire modeling world. So in order to do that, we go to the characteristic information that's being measured at this fine scale. So I think this gets at the second part of your question. And we train what we call these allometric equations, in which we take something that's easy to measure, like a tree's diameter, for example, and relate that to something that's hard to measure, like how much biomass is on the tree. And all of these things are coming from really fine scale data collections, whether that's the Forest Inventory and Analysis database, or there's another database out there as well called the Legacy Tree Database, which was instrumental in training some of these modern day biomass equations that we're using. So I see that whole thing, like questions 1 and 2 that you asked, is being really fundamentally related, actually.
Yeah, let me just add to that. So getting the amount of biomass on a tree is, if you're actually measuring it, is an unbelievable amount of work. Okay. There was a study where some folks at our lab did this back in the early 2000s, in which they had full-time crews working all summer on 5 small plots. And in each plot, they would send climbers up into the tree and cut off some of the tree and lower them down, and then weigh the branches, divide each branch into its different components, and get weights for the foliage and different size classes of material on each branch. Okay. And with a crew of like 6 people, it took them, I think, 5 months to do 5 plots. Okay. And they got this tremendous amount of data, and then it was, many, many months to simply enter the data after that, because they had hundreds and hundreds of branches per tree with all these weights of all these different categories. And that's an example of the last thing you want to do is have everybody have to do that again. So that kind of data gets leveraged heavily in modeling. So like people can then, take those weights that were, connected to like a branch diameter and say, how much stuff do we typically have on a branch? Okay. And from a similar perspective, there's been a number of studies over the years in which people have cut trees down and then weighed them and got the biomass and broken out all the different components. And from that, we have this whole arena of allometric equations that relate tree diameter to different biomass quantities. And we're very grateful that other people have done that work before this, because without that, we wouldn't have any leverage to get there. And it's actually kind of a really amazing thing about trees that simply measuring their diameter at so-called breast height, which is 1.35 meters, okay, is, for most trees, it is incredibly predictive of how much biomass is on that tree. And there's a whole lot of cool science behind that, but it comes down to the diameter of the tree at that point is controlling how much water can go through it, which has a huge amount to do with how much foliage can use that water, and the foliage is growing the tree. So all those things relate. It's this really amazing thing. Anyway, yeah. So the being able to leverage data that has and science that's been done previously is critical to doing this, because otherwise it's intractable. You like simply cutting up and taking a single shrub and breaking it out into different fuel components can take multiple days.
I mean, I'd even add as well, when we
work.
consider plants or trees as dynamic living beings, the very process of cutting them up into pieces and measuring them impacts the remainder of the pieces. I mean, there's serious questions about sort of the overall feasibility of the sampling to begin with.
Yeah, so it's funny because you think of forestry or trees as kind of basic, but once you get into it, they're super complicated. Yeah, which makes it a fun arena to work in terms of science.
It's been one of the most fun things about doing this set of lightning talks, right? I mean, you're both aware that I knew nothing about forestry or fire when I started here at SDSC, and still know very little. But to hear about how all these different parts of the scientific enterprise come together, I wanted to ask you, there's this relationship between the tree diameter at breast height and then all these things we can know about the relative weight of the different types of foliage and stems in it. Is that species neutral, or do different species have different ratios of foliage to stem and whatever else?
Good question. Yeah, different species have different relationships to how they use the water and everything to grow the foliage that they have. So yeah, it is species specific. We tend to organize it by species groups just to make it easier, because in fact, not all species have reliable biomass equations. And so you have to aggregate it a bit typically to get workable data.
There's like tree families that have similar models, and so you extrapolate from the ones that have had lots of research.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. All right, I think the last question that I've got to ask, we have these teams that are thinking about looking at point clouds with millions of points and satellite photos and all of this sort of stuff. If you were starting on this project from first principles, or advising someone whose job was to start thinking about a vegetation model or a tree list from first principles, what advice would you have on where to start looking to do these kind of computations?
Yeah, that's a great question. I personally am a very visual person. So whenever I get data, the first thing I do is spend time looking at it and just getting an understanding of what it is, what it represents, what it measures well, and where the outliers are. And I think because point clouds are a fundamentally 3D data source, doing that requires sort of a three-dimensional visualization component to it. We're lucky that it's not 4D data or these kinds of things. So one of the best pieces of advice I'd have would be to download a piece of software that can visualize these point clouds. So I think Cloud Compare is a great example. There's likely browser-based tools as well. And to just spend some time looking at the data and understanding what it is it's measuring and what it's measuring well.
Yeah, and along those lines, yeah, what you'll do when you see the data is you'll see that there's things that are easy about it and things that are not. So like it's remarkable how intuitively we can look at a collection of 3D points and say, yeah, that is a coherent tree. Okay. But you got two trees right next to each other, and getting a computer to say this point is part of that tree and that point is part of that tree, that's also challenging. Yeah, I think Cloud Compare is a really important tool for seeing this data and just understanding it. And I fully agree with Anthony that any complex data project should start with exploration and just looking at what the data does. It enables you to leverage your intuitive brain much better. And then many of the abstract aspects of these things become more intuitive and more clear just by looking at it. The other thing I would recommend doing is looking at some of the code that is out there. There's, for most things, like in almost every problem, somebody's already put some work into it. So there's a number of publicly available code bases that people can use in R, which is a common statistical modeling software that's very widely available and used a lot by folks in grad school. And then Python has a lot of code as well. There's all sorts of different tools and codes that people can access, and many times they'll have an example data set that comes with it that you can play with as well. So those can be really useful.
Outstanding. Well, thank you both again for taking the time to join me today. Those of you watching at home, please be sure to watch the rest of our lightning talks on wildfire and wildfire management technologies. We'll see you there.
Thanks again, John. Really great to be part of this conversation.